The last thing to do was undo the head bolts. I waited in anticipation to see what was hiding behind the cylinder head. My dad gripped the cylinder head and started wiggling it off the pushrod tubes. But again, we were pleasantly surprised by what we saw. The tops of the pistons looked fine. Other than being covered in carbon, there was no sign of damage on the piston domes from a stray valve or rogue debris getting into the combustion chamber. Just years of combustion built up on their domes. My dad then pulled the pushrod tubes off, one by one. And then took the barrels off the pistons. I peered through the crankcase at the crank. From what I could see, everything was looking pretty good. We moved on to the next job, removing the pistons from the connecting rods. To make life a little bit easier, we first took off the barrel studs. This was a long, tedious process of first locking two nuts against each other on the end of the stud, and then using the nut closest to the engine case to undo and extract the stud. It was painstakingly repetitive work, but eventually all 16 barrel studs were out. Once all the studs were out, we then removed the gudgeon or piston pins, or at least we tried to. I removed the retaining circlip on the first piston, and then tried to push the gudgeon pin out. So now, can I just push the gudgeon pin out?
You should be able to push the pin out from the side with the clip to the side without the clip.
Yeah, not that loose.
Is it still tight?
But it wouldn't budge. I tried again, pushing harder, to the point my thumbs hurt, but nothing. This was not easy. We grabbed a drift and gave it a tap. Still nothing. I feared we might have our answer. Something wasn't right. These gudgeon pins were lock solid, even when we tried drifting them out. Why would it be so tight?
The only thing you do is warm the piston up with a bit of air.
My dad had a point about heating the pistons, but I decided to go and read the manual. It turns out original mild Porsche pistons and gudgeon pins were designed with an interference fit, which meant removing them wasn't going to be as simple as just pushing them out. According to the workshop manual, the proper way to install and uninstall them is to heat the piston to 80 degrees C using a special tool, and then drive the pin out with a drift. There was just one small problem. My dad didn't exactly have Porsche's electric piston heater special tool thing sitting in his toolbox. But what he did have was a hot air gun, so we improvised. After heating the piston up, we tried again, and this time saw movement. Finally. One piston. The idea of heating the piston with the special tool, or hot air gun if you don't have one, helps create thermal expansion and release the tightly fitting gudgeon pin in the piston. This worked doubly as well on Trouble's pistons. Her engine's a Super 90, and as part of this engine classification, her pistons are made from aluminium, and aluminium has almost twice the thermal expansion coefficient of steel which the gudgeon pins are made from. As a result, for the same increase in temperature, it expands almost twice as much, helping free the gudgeon pin from its tight fit in the piston. Anyway, enough science and back to removing pistons. We found a foolproof piston removing process. I removed the circlips, my dad heated the pistons, I held the wood, and my dad drove the pins out. It was like watching a well-oiled machine at work. And while you might not think it, my role of official wood holder was critical to getting these pins out. Without supporting the back side of the piston and providing reaction against my dad's hammer strikes, the pins wouldn't have moved anywhere. Instead, we'd have probably just damaged the big end bearings on the conrods, or worse, bent a conrod. With all the pistons removed, we were one step closer to cracking open the crankcase. But, since the oil filter bowl was full, we figured it'd probably be best to drain the engine of oil first before moving forward. I was prepared with a waste oil container and my dad undid the drain plug. What you can't see through my dad's back is the thick black sludge that came pouring out. If there is one foolproof way to guarantee you don't have an oil leak, is to make sure your engine oil is as thick as an Italian hot chocolate. You know, the one so thick a wooden spoon could stand up in it. While the engine was drip drying, We started working on the next challenge, undoing the pulley nut on the crank. Similar to undoing the fan nut, we had to find a way to stop the crank rotating. We decided on a flywheel locking tool.
To undo this nut, we have to stop the crank rotating. You can buy a tool for this, we don't have the tool, so we're going to make one. What we're going to do is create something like this, which is toothed, which will mesh with the starter ring gear teeth, and then we bolt to the casing, which will lock it in place, allowing us to undo that nut. To make this, I'm going to get a profile, the gear profile off the starter ring, and how I'm going to do that is with a piece of paper, I'm just going to trace So there's my profile.
It's underbar. Really better on
It's actually better there.
I transferred my gear profile trace to my piece of steel and carefully cut out the teeth with an angle grinder. With our new tool finished and installed, my dad put our biggest breaker bar on the nut to crack it loose. Except nothing cracked. The only thing that moved was the engine rotating on the stand. It was FT tight.
Oh, this is tight.
Time for plan B. Plan B was the same as plan A, except this time with all 75 kilos of me standing on the engine stand, leaning against my dad's rotation. We were risking disaster. With this much force going through the crankcase flange where my flywheel locking tool was mounted, we could have cracked the case itself. And then a massive crack. Had we just destroyed the crankcase? Luckily, it was the threads giving up their grip and not my crankcase. That was ridiculously tight, considering Porsche didn't even specify a torque value for it. In hindsight, we shouldn't have locked the flywheel against the crankcase, but you learn.
Okay, can I just make a suggestion now?
Go on.
Right, with this nut on, it's quite useful for rotating the engine.
Okay.
So we're going to leave this on,
Yeah.
right?
Now undo the...
Take the clutch off,
Yeah.
clean up the face on the flywheel if necessary, clock the flywheel to see how it's running, if it's running true, see what the end float is on the crankshaft. Right, because if
My dad's going to do quite a bit of stuff and I'm going to go make some coffees.
because if that's all okay,
End
then-
flow seems okay.
Clock the flywheel, check the end float. All of a sudden, this engine strip down is getting technical. But my dad did have a point. It would be really useful to know what these measurements are before we take the engine apart and the crank out. They'll give us an indication of where, and if there isn't anywhere, at least give us an idea of what we should be aiming for when we rebuild it. I did as I was told and took the clutch pressure plate off.
That's gone straight over my head. Let me take this off and you speak me through it.
do you not clean any of the tools?
Are your hands clean? Do you want to just undo that? No, what I've done here is I've put a very nice protective film
Oh, patina.
over your spanners so they
Patina.
don't rust.
Is that what it is?
Wow. So, oh Jesus, it's heavy, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a clutch. Here we go. Here is my clutch friction plate.
Should just fall off, but it's frozen to that. It's rusted. It's stuck to this. It's rusted to that.
Oh, that should just be free
You
floating.
whack it with a nylon mallet.
Oh,
right?
whack it with a finger.
There you go.
So that is the...
Friction plate. This is the clutch itself as such. The friction plate in the release state is clamped between this and the flywheel, and then the gearbox primary shaft is on that spline. So if this is driven, it drives the gearbox. When you put your foot in the clutch, it pulls that away, unclamps the friction plate from the flywheel, and allows that to freewheel, such that the engine doesn't drive the gearbox.
But anyway, I'm going to put a new one of these in the car because Trouble's going to do a few weirdies in her time, and I'll probably burn through quite a few of these in the process. So it'd be good to start off with a new one, I think. Nice. Clutch. Done.
With the clutch assembly off, we could finally get at the friction face on the flywheel and start taking my dad's measurements.
My dad's gone and got his dial indicator. You can tell who's the real engineer in the family, measuring end floats and all sorts of whatnot. Engineers aren't made like they used to be. Now we just sit on computers drawing silly pictures, making extrusions and fillets and all that.
So we're going +2, -2. I mean, we've got a rusty surface we're working on.
It's pretty
But
flat.
it's 400s. It's got a 400s run out at that point. So now we have to go and consult the manual.
After consulting the manual, I discovered that the factory workshop manual doesn't actually specify a flywheel runout. But after some digging, I found that in the 356 community, a runout of 0.1 of a millimeter is considered acceptable. So our flywheel runout of 0.04 millimeters is looking pretty good. Next, we measured the end float, the axial movement of the crank.
That's now at 5. It's going to 30. There's about 0.25 there.
Which gave us an end float of around 0.25 millimeters, a quarter of a mil. According to the manual, the factory setting range is between 0.13 millimeters to 0.18 millimeters, and with a maximum wear limit of 0.3 millimeters, we might not be in the setting range, but we're on the right side of the wear limit.
It's not the end of the world, put it that way.
No.
It's not completely knackered.
No.
It's within the maximum.
Once we'd finished my dad's precious measurements, we decided to take the flywheel off next. I reinstalled my homemade flywheel locking tool because once again we had to stop the crankshaft from rotating. I grabbed our longest breaker bar, again, and pushed with everything I had.
Nothing happening.
Wow!
Nothing. It wouldn't budge. I shifted my weight, planted my feet and tried again. Still nothing. No matter how much of my body weight I put behind it, it wouldn't move.
One of the biggest problems is you can't actually get on it very well.
I mean, it is on, but it's only just on, isn't it? I'm a bit nervous about the...
Slipping.
It's slipping. You've got to grind the socket down.
Actually, we heat it.
Yeah.
We heated the other one, didn't we?
Yeah.
So we tried heating it with a hot air gun, and I tried again.
Go
And again, nothing happened. This gland nut wasn't moving anywhere. Defeated, we went back to the other end of the crankshaft and at least made some progress by finally removing the pulley nut for good and pulling the pulley off.
Okay. Spanner.
With the pulley out the way, I could then also take off the last piece of engine tin work. Now the engine was pretty much as stripped down as we could get it, without taking the flywheel off. I had to get the flywheel off, as there were two nuts holding the engine case together hiding behind it, and there was no way I'd be able to undo them with the flywheel on. My dad decided to have a go on the flywheel nut, just in case I was being weak. Even with his weight on the end of our breaker bar, it still wouldn't budge.
No. There's a lot of force going on, that, isn't there?
We decided to consult the manual and the Porsche 356 registry. It was just as well we did. It turns out this nut is torqued to 490 Newton meters, and according to the registry, it is notoriously difficult to undo. One forum post read, "You can't expect to loosen the gland nut on a short block sitting high up on a table," and another post came with a serious warning. "Whatever you do, don't use the flywheel lock to hold the flywheel. You have a good chance of breaking out a piece of the case." Fantastic. Most people in the forum swore by using a tool called a torque dude, so I bought one.
Something very exciting has just arrived in the post. Last weekend, me and my dad were stripping the engine and we came to taking the flywheel off the crankshaft and it stumped us. We couldn't get it off. No matter how much we tried, we could not undo the flywheel bolts. So we've been researching on the Porsche 356 registry and been told about a tool called a torque dude, and we've bought one.
I think you just need to get that on the flywheel.
The idea here with this torque dude is that this fits on the 36mm nut. This little pinion type gear meshes with the starter ring, and then you can put a socket on here. Turn this, which in essence, I believe this all stays stationary. So what that actually does is turns the flywheel and crank with respect to the flywheel nut, in essence, undoing the flywheel nut on the crank. But problem is, I actually can't get this tool on the flywheel nut very well. It doesn't go on fully because this outside edge interferes with the flywheel. When we were trying to get it off with our own tool, we actually had to grind down a chamfer to get that on properly here. So that goes on much further. You get much more connection and more land on the nut than I am with this at the moment. So what I'm now going to do is just grind a similar chamfer onto this tool such that it actually gets on that nut properly, and then we'll be able to see if we can get it undone. So what we've done is we've put a chamfer on this tool. So what I'm now going to do is assemble the torque dude. It goes in here, get a washer, here. So that should be on. My dad's going to hold it in place. Okay, let's see if this does anything. Riding out the start. Just stretching. That's no longer engaging. That's all. Torque dude is not much of a dude. That was 150 quid's worth of
I like it.
Do you think we can take this back? I'll paint it.
Sadly, the torque dude didn't live up to the praise it was given on the 356 forum, and just so everyone is clear, I didn't take it back. It is still in the toolbox. It serves as a painful reminder of wasted money. Anyway, we're back to square one. I devised a new plan.
We've attached a bar to the
Flywheel!
and that's now reacted against the floor here. I've raised the floor with some bricks. I've got my 36mm socket on a breaker bar, only 1/2 inch, so we're not going to go crazy. And we've got a torque extender that we're going to slide on here. And then, yes! Something's gone, I don't know what. Something's... Oh, easy.
Anyone else trying to undo a 356 or a 912 gland nut, pass on the flywheel locking tool and the torque dude thing, that's a waste of money. Long bars are your friend.
It's off. It's off. There it is. That was sodding tight.
How much pressure did you put on that bar?
A lot. I didn't think it was going.
Once it was undone and all the heavy lifting was done, my best mate Alex popped round to help finish the strip down. 3 engineers in the garage? Nothing could stop us now. My dad carefully jemmied the flywheel loose while Alex supported it. The last thing I wanted after all this work was it to crash to the floor, It came away safely, and surprisingly, the back of the flywheel wasn't too rusty. With it off, we could also finally see the 2 crankcase nuts that would have kept us from opening up the crankcase with the flywheel still in place. Before we tackled those, the last 2 things to do were removing the front cover and taking off the oil sump from the bottom of the engine. Alex started on undoing the front cover fixings. Once they were all off, we then put our 3 engineering degrees to use, trying to figure out how to free this front cover from the crankcase. The unanimous decision was with a hammer.
We might have just taken the front case off. We have one incontinent engine.
You wriggle it off.
More hammering might be required, Alex.
You should be able to wriggle that. You should be able to wriggle that.
Let's turn off the top. It's off. It's off. Oh. I've never seen something so sexy in my life. And this is how the fuel pump works. We're getting a drive off this. This weird gear is driving this helical gear. And this little bit, its profile changes.
It's eccentric.
It's eccentric, there we go, that's the word. So when you have this in, it's now open, and then it closes, and it's open and it closes. So once this has got pressure against it, what happens is it pushes it up and down. Yeah. And that's how my fuel pump works.
I think we could maybe clear up this mess.
Yeah. Which one? I've got oil everywhere.
Right, we'll just put that down over there.
I tidied up the oil slick, and then we spun the engine onto its side to remove the engine sump. This has 10 nuts holding it on. A little bit overkill if you ask me, but Porsche clearly didn't want this thing coming off or leaking. I worked my way through them and then wiggled the sump cover off. This quickly became more complicated than I expected. There was a sump cover, an intermediate plate, as the parts catalogue calls it, an oil strainer, and gaskets between each. Quite the assembly. To make it worse, it was all thick in what used to be engine oil. I put it straight into a bath of petrol. That was it. The last thing stopping me from cracking open this engine was off. The only thing between me, the crankshaft seeing daylight for the first time in 60 odd years, and finding out if there was anything disastrous with Trouble's engine, was a series of crankcase bolts. There were 16 in total. Well, technically 14 crankcase bolts and the 2 camshaft bearing bolts that were hiding behind the flywheel. I started by undoing the 6 central M8 dome cat nuts, then moved to the 2 camshaft bearing bolts, which are actually nuts on studs set into one half of the crankcase, and then finally I removed the 8 perimeter bolts. That was it. The last bolts had been removed. Now, all we had to do was split the case. Except, after 62 long years, it did not want to come off its dowels. We tried gentle persuasion. Then, not so gentle persuasion. This engine was stubborn, like it knew we were about to expose whatever had led to its decades of silence. Luckily, there were 3 engineers in the room, and a toolbox full of hammers. What followed was a battle. Screwdrivers jammed into seams that barely existed, hammers delivering blow after blow in the hope of breaking 62 years of defiance. The case absorbed it all. And then finally, it gave in. There were signs it was separating. With each hammer strike, the case seam widened until it was off its dowels. Finally. My dad then carefully lifted the right hand side of the crankcase off the studs, holding his breath. And there it was. The crankshaft, conrods, camshaft, perfectly frozen in time. Preserved in thick engine oil. Every part sat exactly as it had when the engine was last turned over. Untouched, unseen, until now. On first glance, everything was looking pretty good. Nothing looked obviously broken, and all the conrods looked straight. But to be 100% honest, this was the first time I'd ever opened up an engine. I didn't really know what it should have looked like. I then lifted the camshaft out and pulled the crank out with the conrods attached. the engine was finally stripped. I'd made a pretty big mess. It was now time to tidy it all up and begin the rebuild.